There is a kind of power that makes no sound. It does not ride at the head of an army, nor thunder from any pulpit. It lies flat and silent on a sheet of paper, in the shape of a man's name set down in his own hand, and from there it moves the world without once raising its voice. In that country, in the autumn of that year, a signed name was the realest thing there was. A man wrote his name and a house changed hands. He wrote it again and a ship sailed, or did not sail. He wrote it a third time, and a family that had stood for 300 years went on standing, or quietly ceased to be. The great houses of the Shire looked as though they were built of stone and oak and old blood. They were not. They were built of paper, deeds and settlements and promises to pay, contracts and mortgages and last wills, all of it held together by the small black miracle of ink drying on a page. Pull one signed name loose from the bottom of the right document, and the stone itself would come down. And in all that country of paper, there was one kind of name that never appeared at the foot of anything that mattered: a woman's name. A woman might be born, and christened and courted and wed and buried, and never once in the whole of her life set her hand to a single page the law would trouble to read. At the altar, her name was folded into her husband's the way a stream is folded into a river, and after that, it was his name that signed, and his hand that held the pen. She kept nothing she had not been given leave to keep. She signed nothing that signified. Her name, however old and however good, was on nothing at all. This is the story of a woman whose name was on nothing, in a world where the only real thing was a name on paper. And it is the story of the autumn she set out to change that. She lived at Fenmarch, which was the seat of the Dukes of Alderley, a long, pale house set in a fold of the hills with a slow river at its foot, and the county town of Wexbury, an hour distant by the good road. It was the season of the quarter day, when the rents came in, and the accounts were closed, and the whole ordered machine of a great estate turned over its books for the reckoning. The gardens were going to rust and gold. The mornings came up white with mist off the water and burned clear by noon. It was, everyone agreed, a beautiful autumn. The Duchess of Alderley watched it from her window and was very calm. She had reason not to be calm, and every soul at Fenmarch knew it, from the steward down to the boy who blacked the boots. Every soul at Fenmarch had marked how calm she was, and not one of them knew what to make of it. She kept her rooms. She kept her accounts, which no one had asked her to keep and no one knew she kept. She read, and she watched, and she waited, with the particular stillness of a person who is not idle at all, but only very early. For the Duchess of Alderley understood paper better than any man in the Shire. She had been raised in it, and though her own name was still on nothing, she had already decided quite calmly, in the long, bright mornings of that beautiful autumn, exactly what she would one day ask her husband to sign. Her name was Amabel, and there had been a time not many years gone when men in the city rose to their feet when it was spoken. She had been Amabel Voss then, the only child of Ozias Voss, and in the counting houses and the coffee rooms of the capital, the name of Voss had carried the particular weight that is given to a fortune made honestly and made well. Now she was the Duchess of Alderley. It was a far higher thing to be, by every measure the world kept, and by every measure that mattered to her. She was less than she had ever been in her life. The lowering had come on the way. Frost comes to a window first at the edges, then across the whole pane. In the early season of the marriage, she had been mistress of Fenmarch in fact, as well as in name. The keys had been hers. The household had brought its questions to her and taken her answers as final. Then, month by quiet month, the questions began to go elsewhere. An order she gave at breakfast would be gently undone by dinner, and no one could ever quite say how. The servants, who missed nothing, had learned to read the weather of the house, and the weather told them plainly which way the wind now set. They were not unkind to her. That would have been easier to bear. They were kind in the careful lowered voice that people keep for the sick and for the soon-to-be-turned-out. She felt it most in the smallest things. A footman who waited to be told a thing twice. A housekeeper who brought the week's business to the Duchess with her eyes already turned toward the door as though listening for some truer authority to arrive. That autumn, the best guest rooms in the south wing had been opened and aired and hung with fresh curtains. And no one had told the Duchess who was expected, and the Duchess had not asked, for she had understood at once, and because she had learned by then that the asking of a question was only another way of bleeding where they could watch. She read the house the way she had been taught to read a ledger, by what was written and by what was carefully left blank. She knew to the shilling what the estate spent and what it owed. She knew which tradesmen in Wexbury had not been paid, and which had been paid too readily and too well, and what that told her about where the money was going and into whose keeping. She knew, though no one had said a word of it to her, a great deal more than anyone at Fenmark imagined she could know. The county had long since settled its opinion of her. She was the financier's daughter, they said, handsome enough and cold, and the Duke had done a brave thing to stoop and a natural thing to tire, and there was an end of it. She let them keep the opinion. It cost her nothing, and it kept them from looking closer. She bore all of it with a stillness that unsettled the whole house. A wife so used might have wept and been pitied. She might have raged and been managed. This one did neither. She rose early. She walked in the cold gardens while the mist still lay on the river. She sat long hours at the little desk in her dressing room over a book of figures no one knew she kept, setting down sums in a small, exact hand, checking the arithmetic of men who never dreamed she could check it. She was not idle. She was the opposite of idle. She was a woman doing careful arithmetic in a burning house, and doing it calmly because she had reason to believe that she alone knew where the water was kept. Only once, in all that autumn, did the calm break, and only when she was entirely alone. She had come upon a glove of her own put away in a drawer, a good glove of pale kid that she had worn on her wedding day, and the sight of the girl who had once worn it, who had believed then that she was being carried into safety at last, undid her for the space of a minute together. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the glove against her mouth and made no sound at all. Then she rose and washed her face in cold water and went down to see about the accounts. She could not afford the girl who had worn that glove. She had buried her carefully and did not mean to dig her up. It was on an afternoon near the end of that week, as the light was going amber over the river, that the sound she had been waiting for, without letting herself name it, came at last up the long drive. Wheels on gravel and the tired blowing of horses, a heavy traveling carriage, and behind it a second, lighter one that she did not know. The Duke of Alderley was home from the capital, where he had been these 3 weeks together, and the Duchess, standing very still at her window, with the closed ledger under her hand, saw at a single glance the thing the whole house had been airing rooms against for a fortnight. Her husband had not come home alone. To understand the calm, one must go back, past the carriage on the gravel and the strange second coach behind it, past the aired rooms and the quietly countermanded orders, all the way to the making of the marriage itself. For the calm had not been born in her. It had been given to her on purpose by the one person who had ever loved her without a single condition, and it had been given to her against exactly such an autumn as this one. Ozias Voss had begun with nothing but his wits and a clerk's stool by a cold window. He was the grandson of a tallow chandler and the son of a man who had failed at everything he set his hand to, and he had climbed out of that by the one ladder the world could not deny him, which was that he was cleverer with money than almost anyone alive, and rarer still, honest with it. He lent where others would not, and was repaid where others were ruined. In 30 years he built a fortune that princes borrowed against. The world took his money gratefully, at arm's length, and shut its fine doors against his blood, for gold might be laundered clean in a single generation, but birth could not be bought in one, and everyone agreed that a man who had once smelt of tallow smelt of it always, however he perfumed himself. His one softness in all the world was his daughter. He raised her strangely for a girl of her prospects. Where other men gave their daughters music and a little French and a great deal of silence, Esaias Voss gave his the run of his counting house. He taught her figures before she could properly sew. He taught her to read a contract the way a surgeon reads a body for the place where the harm was hidden. He told her more than once that of all the things men held up as sacred, only paper ever told the truth, because paper alone could be made to hold a man to what he had sworn when the swearing no longer suited him. She had thought it a dry sort of love. When she was young, she came to understand it was the deepest love he knew how to give, which was to arm her. Then had come the dukedom of Alderley, 300 years old, proud as Lucifer, and eaten hollow from within by debt. Its young master Peregrine was the handsomest man in 3 counties, and quietly drowning. There was a bargain to be struck, and both fathers before the young man understood it, and it was struck. Voss Gold would redeem the mortgages, buy back the sold land, and set the ancient house upright again upon its foundations. In exchange, the financier's daughter would be made a duchess, and the grandson of a chandler would have his blood carried, at one remove, into a coronet at last. Both sides called it love where the world could hear, and a contract where it could not. It was, in truth, a good deal more of the second than the first. Had she loved him, she had wanted to, which the young mistake for the same thing. Peregrine had been all warmth and laughter in the courting of her, and she had taken the warmth for the man and not for the manner, as the young will. Her father had watched the courtship with his shrewd, tired eyes and said little, but he had drawn the marriage settlement himself, with more care than he had ever spent on any bargain of his life, and he had drawn it through his own man of business, a grave and silent person named Elias Crane, who had served Voss for 40 years, and had never once in that time been heard to say a word that was not needed. Voss lived to see her wed, and was dead within the 12th. And once his gold had done its work, once the debts were paid, and Fenmark stood clear and clean upon the land again, the Duke's ardor cooled as quickly as sealing wax off the flame. The fortune was spent. The wife remained. And the wife was the price of the rescue, a reminder, in silken pearls, that the proud house of Alderley had been hauled out of the ditch by a chandler's gold. A shallow man cannot forgive the person who has saved him, for the debt sits in the room like a creditor. Resentment in such a man curdles fast to contempt. She became a thing already paid for, a note long since cashed, a fixture of the house no more regarded than the portraits of better wives upon the stairs. Through all of it she had been calm, and the reason she was calm was a single memory she had turned in her hands 10,000 times. Near the very end, when he was too weak to sit up, her father had sent the nurse away and called her close. He had held her hand in his dry, cold one, and told her again, as though it were the whole of his last will, that he had never once in his life signed a paper he had not first read to its final word, and that this was the only wisdom he had worth the leaving. Then, as she rose to let him sleep, he had said the thing she never understood. He said, "Remember that I read the settlement myself, Amabel. Every word of it. Remember, whatever they come to do to you in that house, that I read it to the last line and that I was content. When the day comes, and it will come, do not weep, and do not beg them for anything. Send for Crane. You will know the day." He had died 2 nights after, and she had never learned what he meant, and had half persuaded herself it was only the wandering of a dying mind. But now, standing at the window with the amber light failing on the river and a strange woman being handed down, smiling from the second carriage below, the Duchess of Alderley felt the old words settle in her cold and clear as a struck bell, and she understood that the day her father had spoken of had come at last. He came into the house on a wave of his own good humor, which was the cruelest part of it, for a cold husband she had long since learned to weather, and it was the warmth she could not bear. The Duke of Alderley crossed his own threshold, laughing at something said behind him, hat in hand, color high from the road, handsomer at 35 than most men are at 20. He had the gift of arriving. A room warmed when he entered it, and the servants who had crept about the house for a fortnight in the lowered voices of a sick room stood suddenly, straighter, gladder, restored by the mere fact of him, and the Duchess understood in that moment with a perfect and level clarity that this was the whole of his talent and the whole of his ruin. He could make a house love him in the doorway and owe the butcher in Wexbury by the same afternoon. Behind him, handed down from the second carriage, with a care he had never once in 7 years shown his wife, came the woman. She was younger than the Duchess, though, not by so much as she plainly believed, and she was very lovely in the warm, high-colored way that reads across a room, and she came into Fenmarch as though she had at last come home to a place too long kept from her. She looked up at the pale front of the house and along the great hall and up the wide stair with its ranks of painted duchesses, and she smiled, and the smile said that she had measured every yard of it and found it would suit. The Duke handed her forward. "My dear," he said to the woman, and not to his wife, "you will want to see the south rooms. They have the morning light." And to the hall at large, warm and easy, and not troubling to lower his voice, he said, "This is Lady Sabine Marot. She is to be our guest. See that she wants for nothing. Our guest." He set the word down in front of his wife, and the whole assembled household, as a man lays a card he knows will take the trick. The Duchess came down the last of the stairs, then unhurried, in the plain dark gown she had put on that morning, and she was as calm as the surface of the river at first light, and the calm was so complete that it silenced the hall more surely than any outcry could have done. She did not look at the woman with hatred. She looked at her with attention, the long, steady, interested attention of a person reading a document, taking in the cut of the traveling dress that was a little too new, and the jewels that were a little too good for the modest name of Marot, and entering each small fact in the private ledger she kept behind her eyes. Then she inclined her head precisely as much as courtesy required and not 1 degree more, and she said, in a voice pitched for the whole hall to hear, "You are welcome to Fenmarch, Lady Sabine. I hope the road was not too hard on you. We keep early hours here. You will find the house has more history in it than comfort, but the morning light in the south rooms is all my husband says." It was so perfectly, so unanswerably gracious that it landed among them like a blade laid flat. Lady Savine's smile faltered for the smallest part of a second, because she had braced herself. One saw for tears or for fury had perhaps looked forward to one or the other, and had been handed instead a courtesy she could not refuse and could not match. The Duke's easy color deepened by a shade. He had expected a scene, and would have known what to do with a scene, and been the injured reasonable man before his servants. He did not know what to do with this. That night there was a dinner, because the Duke willed it, and it was a strange and glittering and dreadful meal. The 3 of them at the long table with the good plate out, and the candles lit, and the servants moving soft-footed in the shadows, all of them witness. Lady Sabine talked and the Duke laughed, and the Duchess ate a little and said the right small things at the right small intervals, and watched them both across the flowers with her, even at tension. She was not gathering grievance. She had grievance enough to sink a ship and had long since stopped counting it. She was gathering something else. She was watching how far he had already gone, and how sure of himself he had become, and how little he now troubled to hide, and she was measuring, as her father had taught her to measure, exactly how ready the ground was. It was as the covers were drawn and the wine set on, and the Duke leaned back, well-fed and well-pleased and expansive, that the Duchess set down her glass and folded her hands and spoke. She said quite quietly, in the voice one uses for a thing already decided, Peregrine, when your business with the lawyers is next before you, there is one last paper I would ask you to sign. It concerns myself, and it will cost you nothing, and I think you will find it settles everything between us to your satisfaction. I will have it drawn up properly. You need only put your name to it. He looked at her, surprised, and then delighted, for it sounded to him like surrender, and surrender was the one thing that evening had failed to give him. "Of course, my dear," he said, and lifted his glass to her almost fondly. "Whatever you like." And across the candles, Lady Sabine smiled again, restored, certain once more that she had understood the shape of the thing. Neither of them saw the Duchess lower her eyes to her hands, and neither of them, being the people they were, could have read what was written in her stillness, which was not defeat at all. If these long stories are a comfort to your evenings, do consider subscribing so that the next one finds its way to you. There was a man in the capital whose name opened doors that gold could not, and it was to that man that the Duchess of Alderley sat down to write the moment the house was dark. Few of the great families could have told you his face, but every one of them had, at some time or other, had cause to be glad or afraid of his hand. Elias Crane was a solicitor of the old grave kind, of no birth worth the mention, and no fortune he ever displayed, who had come up under Ozias Voss 40 years before as a copying clerk, and had made himself, by pure patience and an inhuman discretion, into the keeper of more dangerous paper than any man in the kingdom. It was said of him that he had never in his life repeated a thing told him in confidence, not to a wife, for he had none, not to a friend, for he was not known to have those either, not even, some said to himself in the privacy of his own thoughts. It was said that half the noble houses of the shire had a secret lodged with Crane, and that he carried them all as a stone carries the names cut into it, without weight and without complaint, and would carry them into the ground. They told stories of him in the coffee rooms, as men tell stories of anything they cannot quite see the whole of. Some said he was cold to the bone, a machine for the keeping of secrets and nothing more, and that Voss had valued him precisely because there was no man in him left over to be bribed or frightened or charmed. Some said the opposite, that under the grey stillness there was a loyalty so total and so quiet that it frightened the men who relied on it. For a man who cannot be bought cannot be controlled, and there is nothing the powerful trust less than a servant they cannot own. What all of them agreed on was the silence. Elias Crane did not explain himself. He did not gossip, and he did not warn, and he did not advise beyond the strict letter of what he was asked. He kept the paper, and he kept the peace, and he kept his mouth shut, and in 40 years no one had ever found the bottom of him. Amabel had known him all her life, and did not know him at all. He had stood grey and silent at the edge of every great occasion of her childhood, at christenings and funerals, and the signing of great bargains. A still figure with a leather case under his arm, more fixture than man. He had drawn her marriage settlement. He had stood at the back of the church on her wedding day, and she remembered now, though she had thought nothing of it then, that he had not smiled when everyone else was smiling, but had watched the ceremony with a grave, close attention, as a man watches a thing being built that he himself has drawn the plans for. "Send for Crane," her father had said. "You will know the day." So now, in the small, cold hours with the candle guttering, she took a sheet of paper and did the first real thing she had done in 7 years. She wrote to him. She did not pour out her wrongs, for she suspected he would have no patience with wrongs, and because she had learned from her father that a paper should say only what it must, she wrote 3 lines. She wrote that her father had told her at the last that she would one day know the day, and to send for him when it came. She wrote that the day had come. She wrote that she would be glad of his counsel at Fenmarch at his earliest convenience, and she signed it with her own name, Amabel, the name that was on nothing, and she sealed it and gave it to the one servant left in the house she was sure of, and it went to Wexbury before dawn to catch the London mail. His answer came back faster than any answer had a right to, which told her something, for a man of such deliberate slowness does not hurry unless the thing is grave. It was 2 lines only, in a hand as spare and upright and unhurried as a row of iron railings. It said that he would come. And it said one thing more. One line she read a dozen times by the morning window and could not open, a line that seemed to know a great deal more than she had told him. It said, "Read nothing they put before you, until I am come, and sign less." Your father foresaw the whole of this. He was, forgive an old man, a far cleverer father than you were permitted to know. Lady Sabine Marrow had come to Fenmark to enjoy herself, and by the end of the first week, she was not enjoying herself at all, and she could not for the life of her have said why. She had a clear and simple picture of how this was to go, and she had earned that picture, for it had gone that way twice before in other houses with other men, and she was better at this than the world gave such women credit for. There was to be a wife, and the wife was to be a problem for a little while, and then the wife was to break. Wives broke in one of two ways in Lady Sabine's experience. They wept and clung and made ugly scenes and were got rid of as hysterical, or they froze into bitterness and made the house a tomb, and were got rid of as impossible. Either served. All that was needed was to be lovely and warm and patient and present, to be the ease against the wife's difficulty, and to wait, and the man, being a man, and this man especially, would in time do the rest himself. She had only to be the soft place he turned to when the hard place at last became unbearable. The trouble was that the hard place declined to become unbearable. The Duchess of Alderley would not break, and would not freeze, and would not, most maddeningly of all, compete. Lady Sabine set little traps of the kind that had never yet failed her, small public cruelties dressed as innocence, remarks about the age of the house and the plainness of the Duchess's gowns and the tragedy of a marriage without children, each one polished and placed just so, in front of servants where possible, and each one the Duchess received with the same unhurried courteous attention, and turned aside so gently and so completely that it was Lady Sabine, somehow, who was left looking small. When Lady Sabine praised her own new jewels, the Duchess admired them, and asked with perfect kindness whether the setting were quite paid for yet, as such fine work often ran on, and the whole table understood the question, and the Duke went red, and Lady Sabine had no answer that did not make it worse.
The Duchess did not raise her voice. She did not need to.
She had spent her girlhood among men who moved fortunes with a murmur, and she had learned from the cradle that the one who shouts has already lost the room. The servants marked it, as servants mark everything. There is nothing a household loves like a mistress who does not deserve what is being done to her, and does not whine about it, and the calm that had unsettled them in her worst weeks began now to work the other way. A woman would not tell you plainly that the wind had shifted, but you felt it. The under-housemaid took to laying the Duchess's fire before the south wings. The old butler Hadwin, who had served 3 dukes and buried 2, began again to bring the household's real questions to the Duchess, and to wait, with his eyes on her face and not on the door, for her answers, and to take them as final. It was a small thing, and it was everything. The weather of the house was turning, and it was turning toward her, and Lady Sabine felt it turn and did not understand it, for by every rule she knew she was winning, and yet the ground beneath the winning had gone strange and soft. The Duke felt it too, and liked it even less, and his liking of it less made him careless, which was precisely what the Duchess watching had known it would do. A shallow man who senses he is somehow losing a game he ought to be winning does not grow cautious. He grows loud. Peregrine began to be openly unkind to his wife in a way he had not quite dared before, as if to prove to himself, and to Lady Sabine, and to the watching house that the calm woman at the foot of his table was nothing, could be treated as nothing, need not be feared as anything at all. He spoke over her. He mocked, lightly, laughingly, her father's trade, the smell of the counting house, the chandler's gold that had bought the very chairs they sat upon, and he did it with a smile so that any objection would seem to have no humor. Each time he did it, the Duchess said nothing, and each time the servants' faces grew a shade more shut, and each time Lady Sabine felt the promised victory recede by another inch into a fog she could not name. What none of them knew was where the Duchess went in the hours she kept to herself. She went to a small locked drawer in the escritoire that had been her father's, that had come to Fenmarch among her things, and that no one had ever thought worth the noticing, being neither valuable nor grand. In it, wrapped in oiled silk against the damp, lay a document she had carried into the marriage and never once had caused to open, a heavy folded parchment thick with clauses and stiff with seals, the fair engrossed copy of the marriage settlement of Amabel Voss and Peregrine Duke of Alderley, drawn by the hand of Elias Crane. She had signed nothing of it herself, for a bride did not, in that country, sign. Her father had signed it, and the Duke had signed it, and the lawyers had witnessed it, and it had been folded away, done and dead these 7 years, a thing everyone concerned believed they understood, and no one had read since the ink was wet. She took it out now in the cold by a single candle, with Crane's strange line running in her head. Read nothing they put before you. Your father foresaw the whole of this. And for the first time in her life, alone in the deep of the night with her father, 6 years in his grave and his last words gone suddenly clear as struck glass, the Duchess of Alderley untied the faded ribbon and unfolded the parchment to its full and considerable length, and bent the candle close, and began, slowly, clause by clause, in her father's own hard exact schooling, to read the paper. No one had troubled to read in 7 years. The paper her father had drawn was not, she began to see as the candle burned low, a marriage settlement in the ordinary meaning of the word, at all. It wore the clothes. It opened with the same grave recitals, every such deed, opened with the parties named, the estates described, the sums acknowledged, all of it in the slow rolling language of the law. But under the clothes it was another thing entirely, patient and terrible and kind, and she read it as her father had taught her to read, slowly under her breath, letting no clause go by until she had turned it over and found what lay on its underside. And clause by clause the true shape of the thing rose out of the parchment, like a face rising out of dark water. The money had not been a gift. That was the first stone, and the whole of the rest was built upon it. The world believed, and her husband believed. Most of all, that Ozias Voss had poured his fortune into the drowning house of Alderley as the plain price of a coronet for his daughter, a thing given outright and gone forever. He had done no such thing. He had lent it. Every pound that had cleared the mortgages and bought back the sold acres and set Fenmarch upright upon its foundations again had gone in not as a gift but as a loan, secured upon the very lands it rescued, the whole of it held in a trust drawn tight as a snare, with Elias Crane named the sole trustee and her father's daughter the sole one to benefit. Then came the clause that stopped her breath, while the marriage stood, and while the Duke kept his wife as a wife under his roof, with her honor whole. The debt was to sleep. No interest would be asked of him. No payment would ever be called. The great loan might lie quiet 100 years and trouble no one, and the house of Alderley might go on believing itself rescued by a gift and welcome. But should the Duke ever, by his own act and of his own free choosing, put his wife away, should he move to separate himself from her, to set the marriage aside, to cast her off, or shut her out, or drive her from her home, then in that same hour the whole debt fell due at once. And because no living Alderley could pay 1/10 of it, the lands themselves stood forfeit to the trust, which was to say, to her. He would keep only what had been his before her father's gold had ever touched him. He would keep the title, 300 years old, and proud as Lucifer, and he would keep the ancient debts that title had carried on its back before the rescue ever came, the debts her father's money had lifted, which would settle again upon his shoulders like a coat taken up from a chair. She sat a long while with the parchment open under her hands and the cold coming up through the floor, and she understood the whole of it at last, and the understanding was like a great bell rung once in an empty church. The genius of the thing, the dreadful and loving genius of it, was that her father had not tried to make a faithless man be faithful. He had known better than any man alive that you could not. He had done the other thing instead. He had made the man's faithlessness the very engine of his ruin. So long as Peregrine kept her, however coldly, however cruelly, so long as he merely left her be, he was safe, and his house was safe, and he might insult her at his own table every night of his life and lose nothing by it. But the moment he reached to be rid of her, the moment he lifted his hand to put her from him, he would bring the whole 300 years down upon his own head. And the more gladly he did it, the more thorough the wreck. And the paper he would sign so very gladly, the one last paper she had promised him so meekly across the candles, that he need only put his name to, the deed of separation that would set him free for the woman in the south rooms, that paper was the act. That was the raised hand. That was the door swinging open over the drop. She had only to have it drawn correctly, and to hand him the pen, and to let him do to himself in his triumph the one thing her father had built 7 years before to make certain he could never survive. She did not let herself feel the size of it yet. She was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that a thing read once in the dark is a thing half read, and that the law kept its cruelest tricks in the coils of its own language, where a single word like shall or may or provided could turn a whole page inside out. She could not be perfectly certain she had read it aright. She would not stake everything on her own reading of a deed she had studied for the first time by a guttering candle. For that she needed the one man living who had drawn it and knew its every joint. For that she needed Crane. But there was more in the little locked drawer than the settlement, and she found it now, folded small. Within the greater parchment, a second and slighter bundle in the spare upright hand she had lately learned to know. It was an account, kept year by year in Crane's own figures, and it took her a moment to see what she was looking at, and when she saw it, her hands went still on the page. For 7 years, quietly, through agents who did not know whose money they carried or whose purpose they served, someone had been buying up the Duke's debts. Every careless marker he had scattered across the card tables of the capital, every note of hand he had signed to a moneylender in a bad week, every small private ruin he had strewn behind him and forgotten, had been gathered in, one by one, patiently, and paid, and kept. The Duke of Alderley believed he owed a little to a great many careless friends. In truth, he owed the whole of it, every farthing, to a single patient hand that had never once asked to be repaid, and was only waiting. She thought she had known the depth of her father's foresight. She had not begun to know it. It was near dawn, and the fire nearly out, when the last small thing found her. And it was the smallest of them all, and it undid her more than the parchment had. Her maid Tamsin, a quiet Cornish girl who had been with her since before the marriage, and had somehow never been sent away, came in to see to the grate, and found her mistress still up and grey with cold, and clucked and built the fire again with her own hands. And Amabel, moved by something she could not have named, asked her the question she had never thought to ask in 7 years, which was how it was that Tamsin had stayed, when so many had gone. Tamsin looked surprised. "Why the wages, my lady?" she said. "2 winters back, when his grace put down the household book and cut us all by a third, mine came right again inside the month, and old Hadwin's too, by a paper from a bank in Wexbury, none of us could make head nor tail of. I always did think it was your ladyship, done quiet so his grace shouldn't know. I never thanked you, for I saw you meant it not to be spoke of." She bobbed and went out, leaving her mistress by the new fire. It had not been Amabel. She had not had the ordering of a shilling in that house for years. It had been Crane, and behind Crane her father, reaching out of the settled dark to keep her people for her against the day, so that when the day came, she should not be quite alone in the house that had cast her off. She had believed herself the loneliest woman in the shire, forgotten by everyone but her own pride. She saw now that she had been watched over all along by a hand she could not see and could not thank, and that she was not one woman standing alone at all, but the last live coal of a fire, An old man had banked with terrible care against exactly this cold morning. It was a strange thing to learn that you had never been alone. It was a warm thing, too, at the end of a freezing night. She folded the papers away and locked the drawer and washed her face in cold water and did not weep, because her father had told her not to weep, and because she had begun to understand that the day had a great deal of work in it yet, and that the first piece of the work was to send again to Crane and to wait and to sign nothing, and to let no paper in the world be put before her until the gray man came. He came on the third day, without announcement, in a hired chaise from Wexbury, and he came in through the servant's door like a tradesman, rather than the front like a guest, which told her before he had said a word that he understood exactly what he was walking into, and meant to give the house nothing to remark upon. Elias Crane was older than she had let herself remember, and grayer, a spare, upright figure, all in decent black with a worn leather case under his arm that she thought might be the same one he had carried at her christening. He bowed to her with a grave and perfect correctness, and he looked at her for a long moment with pale, still eyes that seemed to read her the way she had learned to read a page, measuring in one still glance all that the years in that house had cost her, and keeping, as was his lifelong way, his own counsel. And then he said, the first thing he had said to her, in his own voice, in more years than she could count, "You have read it," he said. "It was not a question. I told you to sign nothing." "Did you sign nothing?" "I signed nothing," she said. "I read it 4 times. I think I understand it. I would be glad to be told I am wrong about none of it." "You are wrong about none of it," said Crane, and set his case upon the table, and opened it. And for the better part of that morning, in the cold, bright library, with the door shut against the house, the gray man laid the whole machine bare for her, joint by joint, dent in a low, exact voice that never rose and never wandered and never once said a word that was not needed. He confirmed the loan and the trust and the sleeping debt. He confirmed the forfeiture. He confirmed, when she asked him plainly, that the gathered markers were real, that he held the whole of the Duke's private ruin in his own keeping, and had held it for years, and that it wanted only a word from her to be called in all at once. And he confirmed the one thing she had most needed and most feared to hear, which was that the trigger of it all must be the Duke's own free act, done of his own choosing, and better far if it were done openly, before witnesses who could never afterward be got to unsay what they had seen. "He must put you away himself," said Crane freely, "gladly, if it can be managed, for a thing done gladly cannot afterward be called a thing done under duress. If you go to him weeping and beg for a separation, the law may one day say you forced his hand and drove him to it, and the whole may be unpicked. But if he casts you off before the county, of his own will, for his own pleasure, believing he does you an injury and himself a service, then no court in the kingdom will ever untie that knot. Your father saw it. Do not spoil it by seeming to want it, seem to dread it, seem to break." It was then that the Duke came in. He had heard, of course. He heard everything in his own house that he cared to hear, and the arrival of a strange black-coated lawyer at the servant's door was a thing the whole household had carried to him by noon. He came into the library without knocking, for it was his library, and he looked at the gray man by the table with an amused contempt he did not trouble in the least to hide. "And who," he said, to the room and not to Crane, "is this?" "Some clerk of your father's come to read me a homily about my debts. You may tell the fellow the Duke of Alderley does not do business with Chandler's men in his own house, and send him back to his stool." Crane said nothing at all. He inclined his head, the exact degree that a servant inclines it to a duke, no more, and began quietly to gather his papers, as a man gathers them who has been dismissed and knows better than to argue. And Amabel, who had spent 7 years saying nothing, while this man mocked her father's trade at his own table, found that she could not do it one more time. She heard herself speak before she had decided to, in a voice pitched clear across the room. "You will not speak so to Mr. Crane," she said. He served my father honestly for 40 years, which is longer than this house has been honest about anything. He has come at my asking, on my business, and he is worth 10 of the men you call your friends, who will not lend you their carriage without a note of hand. You may mock the counting house all you like, Peregrine. It was the counting house that bought the roof over your head, and it is a poor sort of gentleman who spits on the hand that pulled him from the ditch. There was a silence. The Duke's handsome face went first white, and then an ugly red, for he was not used to being spoken to at all, let alone struck across the mouth with the truth in front of a servant. He said something cold and small about hysterics, and the ingratitude of women who forgot themselves, and he turned on his heel and went out, and slammed the door behind him hard enough to shake the books. And Elias Crane, who had gone on quietly stacking his papers all the while, paused with one hand flat upon the leather case, and looked at her, and said very low, "So, you will do." He said it as a man says a thing he has waited a long while to be able to say. Your father wondered, at the end, whether he had armed you too late, whether the house would have broken the edge off you before you learned you had one. He need not have wondered. He raised the case, and from it he drew one last thing, a letter, thick and sealed and yellowed at the folds, with her name upon it in a hand she would have known among 10,000, her father's own. "He bade me keep this until the day," said Crane, "and give it you when I judged you ready. And not 1 hour before. I judge you ready now. Read it when I am gone and you are alone. And now, if you will permit an old man to say one word more than is needed, which I have not done in 40 years, do not be afraid of what is coming. It will look for a little while like your defeat. Let it. Your father built the whole of this to look like your defeat. Until the last page, trust the paper, trust him. And trust," he added, with the ghost of something that was almost warmth in the still gray face, the daughter he was not fool enough to underrate. Then he bowed, and took up his case, and went out the way he had come, and left her alone in the cold library with her father's last letter unopened in her 2 hands, and the whole weight of the coming days settling on her quiet as snow. She did not know yet, for Crane in his caution had not told her that the Duke had already fixed the manner and the hour of his triumph. He had decided in his vanity that so public a humiliation as a chandler's daughter set aside was a thing too good to waste behind closed doors. He would do it where the whole county could see. He would do it at the Michaelmas Assembly, at Wexbury, in a senight's time, before every soul who mattered for 30 miles. He would hand her the deed in the long, bright rooms, and let her sign herself away before them all, and there would be no undoing it, and no forgetting it, and Lady Sabine Marrow standing warm at his elbow to watch it done. Now all the separate threads of that strange autumn drew together into a single cord, and the marvel of it, when she came to see the whole, was that they had never been separate threads at all, but one design, drawn, taut, and waiting, 7 years laid down against a single week. Consider how it stood. There was the one last paper she had asked her husband, so meekly, to sign. There was her own unbroken calm, that the whole house had marked and none had understood. There was the gray silence of Elias Crane, and the sleeping debt, and the gathered markers, and the letter in her father's hand. Each had seemed its own thing, a separate small mystery in a house full of them. And each was in truth one tooth of one wheel, and the wheel was her father's, and it had been turning slowly toward this exact hour since before her wedding day. The paper she had promised to have drawn was the deed of separation itself. She would have it drawn, and she would have Crane draw it, and it would be drawn so perfectly, so unanswerably, in such faultless legal form that when the Duke set his name to it before the county in the fullness of his contempt, he would with that one stroke of the pen do to himself the whole of the ruin the settlement had waited 7 years to work. He thought he was writing her out of his life. He would be signing his life away to her, and thanking her for the pen. She read her father's letter that night alone, and it changed the color of everything, though she told no one what was in it, and kept the deepest part of it locked in her own breast, For a long while after, she read it more than once. And when she had done, she sat very still, and understood that she had spent 7 years being pitied for a marriage that her father, from the far side of the grave, had turned into the safest position a wronged woman ever held in that whole cold country. She had been the queen on the board the entire time, and had been made to feel a pawn, and had let herself feel it, and her father had foreseen even that, and had written to her across all the years of his silence to tell her to hold up her head. In the south rooms, meanwhile, the Duke was merry. He told Lady Sabine that it was all arranged, that the tiresome business would be over within the week, that the wife had as good as offered to sign herself away and had only to be let do it, and that once it was done they should have Fenmarch to themselves and be rid of the counting-house and its dreary daughter forever. He was so pleased with himself that he grew generous and promised things, and Lady Sabine smiled and thanked him, and let him believe she was as easy as he was. But Lady Sabine Marrow was not easy, and had not been easy since the day she arrived, and she was too old a hand at her trade to mistake her own unease for nothing. She had built a life out of reading rooms and reading men, and every instinct she owned was telling her that the calm at the foot of the table was the wrong kind of calm, the calm of a woman who is not losing but winning and does not wish you to know it. She could not have said how she knew. She only knew that a wife who was truly beaten did not look at her husband the way this one did, with that steady, measuring patience, as though she were pricing him. And the arrival of the grey lawyer, and his going away again with nothing said, sat in Lady Sabine's mind like a splinter she could not find to pull. So, while the Duke made merry, Lady Sabine made inquiries. Quietly, in her own way, through her own people, she began to ask what there was to know about Elias Crane, and about the settlement of the marriage, and about what precisely the chandler's daughter had brought into the house and on what terms. It was slow work, for Crane was a hard man to learn anything of, and the terms of a great settlement were not a thing left lying about for the asking. But Lady Sabine was patient too in her fashion, and she had one advantage the Duke did not, which was that she took the quiet woman seriously, and fear is a sharper tool than contempt. She did not learn the whole. She learned enough to be frightened. She learned that the money had been a loan and not a gift, though not yet the deadly condition upon it. And frightened people move too soon, which is the beginning of most ruin. Lady Sabine went to the Duke and pressed him and told him that a week was too long, that lawyers were dangerous, that the thing should be done at once and quietly and not made a public show of at all. But here she reckoned without the Duke's vanity, which was the largest thing about him. He would not be hurried, and he would not be robbed of his triumph before the county, and he told her so laughing, and called her nervous, and would not hear it. The assembly, he said. Michaelmas. Before them all. It is decided. And so it was that the two who meant to be rid of Amabel fell, at the very end, into quarreling with one another over the manner of it, the one hungry for the public show, and the other smelling smoke and wanting only to be gone from the house before it caught. Neither of them knew that the quarrel no longer signified in the least. The trap did not care whether it was sprung in a private room or a public one. It cared only that the Duke should reach out of his own free will and pull the pin. He was going to do that at Michaelmas, before 30 miles of witnesses, in the fullness of his contempt and the height of his joy. The daughter of the counting-house sat quiet in her rooms through all of it, and had her deed drawn, and said nothing, and waited for the assembly, and held her father's letter against her heart, and was afraid, a little in the way that even the surest are afraid before a great thing. But the fear was a thing she had not owned in 7 years, and it was not hatred, and it was not even triumph. It was the plain, clean feeling of a person who has remembered, at long last, that she is not a thing to be signed away by other hands, but a hand that signs. Her whole life the world had made her name into something that was folded into a man's, and vanished. In 1 week, she would set her own name to her own paper and take back everything, and she found that she wanted that, the taking back, far more than she had ever wanted revenge. Lady Sabine, thwarted of her quiet ending and frightened now in earnest, did the thing that frightened people of her kind always do at the last. She went, looking for a weapon, and finding none to hand against the wife, she reached for the nearest innocent instead. She could not touch Crane, who was gone back to the capital and past her reach. She could not shake the Duke from his vain determination to make a show of the thing. So she turned upon the one soft target left in the house, which was the quiet Cornish maid Tamsin, the last servant in Fenmark, wholly the Duchess's own. It was easily done. A ring of Lady Sabine's went missing from the south rooms, a good ring, and was found after a search Lady Sabine herself directed, with many gracious expressions of distress, tucked in the maid Tamsin's box beneath her Sunday apron. The girl swore she had never seen it, wept, went white, swore again. It did not matter. A servant accused is a servant condemned, and Lady Sabine required the girl be turned off at once without a character, which in that country was a sentence very near to starvation, for a maid without a character does not find another place, and a maid without a place does not eat. The Duke, who cared nothing either way, and wished only to please the woman in the south rooms, gave the order. Tamsin was to be gone by morning. And here, the trap, which had been so patient and so sure, came within a hair of springing wrong, for it struck at the one thing that could make Amabel forget her father's whole design in a single hot rush of the heart. She knew the ring was a lie. She knew who had told it and why. And she knew with a sick clarity that the girl about to be thrown into the winter road was the same girl whose wages a dead man's foresight had quietly saved 2 winters back, the girl who had stayed when all the rest had gone, who had built her fire with her own hands and thought she was thanking her mistress for a kindness that had come in truth from the grave. It would have been the easiest thing in the world, and the most human, to go down and fight it there and then, to storm and threaten and spend the whole hoarded power at once to save one weeping girl. She very nearly did. She got as far as the head of the stairs, and then she stopped, with her hand on the cold rail, and made herself think as her father had taught her to think, which is the hardest thing a warm-hearted person is ever asked to do. If she fought now, openly, she showed her hand. She warned them. She turned the calm they could not understand into a plain declaration of war, and gave Lady Sabine, who was already frightened and already asking questions, a week to learn the rest and to stop the Duke from signing. To save Tamsin tonight might be to lose everything, and to lose everything was to fail not one girl, but the whole quiet company her father had spent his last years gathering into her keeping, every soul whose safety rode now upon the deed, being signed clean at Michaelmas. So she did a harder thing than fighting. She did not go down. She let the order stand where the house could see it stand. But that night, by her own hand, she wrote 2 letters and gave them to the stable boy she trusted with a coin and a warning. One went to Tamsin, with money in it, and a direction, and a promise in writing, that if the girl would go quietly to a certain decent house in Wexbury, and wait but 1 week and say nothing to anyone, she would be sent for and set right, and never want a place again as long as she lived. The other went express to Crane. And to the world of Fenmarch it appeared only that the Duchess had bowed her head to yet another cruelty, and lifted not a finger, and the servants who had begun to hope for her grew quiet again, and thought her beaten after all, and Lady Sabine, watching, felt her splinter of unease pushed down a little. For, surely, a woman with any power in her would not have let the girl go. That was the low place. It looked from the outside exactly like defeat, and it was meant to, and the meaning to be no comfort at all, while she lay awake that night, hearing the wheels of the cart that carried Tamsin off in the dark before dawn, trusting a promise, into the cold. Amabel had learned by then to carry a great deal without showing it. She had not learned to like it. She lay awake and bore the weight of the one hard truth her father had never quite written down, which is that to win a long game you must sometimes let a wrong stand for a week, that every honest nerve in you screams to right within the hour, and that the strength to do that is a colder and lonelier strength than any amount of open courage. When the morning of the assembly came at last, gray and still with the first hard frost of the year silvering the fields, the Duke of Alderley was in high good humor, and Lady Sabine was uneasy and could not say why. And the whole county was buzzing with the delicious news that the silent Duchess was to be put away in public that very night. And Amabel dressed herself with great care in the plainest gown she owned, and pinned up her hair and put her father's letter and the drawn deed into her reticule with her own steady hands, and went down to the carriage to be carried to Wexbury, to be, as everyone believed, destroyed. Crane was waiting for her at the decent house in Wexbury, where Tamsin sat safe and wondering by the fire, and it was there, in a small plain parlor an hour before the assembly, that the gray man broke his silence for the second and last time, and said the thing he had carried 40 years to say. He had the finished instrument with him, engrossed fair and folded, the deed of separation drawn, so that it was at once exactly what the Duke believed it to be, and exactly what her father had designed it to be. The same paper wearing two faces. He put it into her hands, and then, instead of bowing and going as was his lifelong habit, he stood and looked at her and spoke. "I have kept my mouth shut for 40 years, he said, because your father taught me young that a man of business who talks is a man of business who is bought, and that the only secret worth keeping is the one you keep from everyone. And I have kept his, and 100 others, and never once been sorry. But he gave me leave, at the end, to say one thing to you when the day came, if I judged you had earned the hearing of it, and you have earned it, and I am an old man, and will not have another chance, so you will hear it now. Your father did not do this for revenge. I want you to know that, before you walk into that room, because you will be tempted in there tonight to think it revenge, and it was not, and he would not have you carry it as revenge. He did it because he loved you, and because he was dying, and because he knew he could not be there to stand between you and the world as a father should. And so he built you a thing that would stand between you when he could not. He did not arm you to destroy that man. He armed you so that no man could ever again make your name into a thing that was signed away without your leave. The wrecking of the Duke is nothing. It is only what falls out of the by-going. The thing itself, the whole of the thing, was to give you back your own name to sign. Do not forget that in there tonight. Sign it as a free woman, not as an avenging one. That is what he wanted. That is the whole of what he wanted." She could not answer him. She had done all the speaking that autumn, and now at the one moment she most wished to, she found she had no words at all, only a stinging in the eyes she would not let fall. And Elias Crane, who had said more in 1 minute than in 40 years, gave her the smallest of bows, and said in his ordinary dry voice, as though nothing had passed, "I will be at the back of the room." Your father was at the back of every room you were ever in. It is where we keep. Now, go and take back what is yours. The Michaelmas Assembly at Wexbury was held that year, as every year, in the long, bright upper rooms of the Assembly House in the county town, and everyone came who was anyone for 30 miles. And that year they came burning with the story, and Lady Sabine Marrow came at the very height of her certainty that she had won, on the Duke's arm, in her finest, and was received as though she were already the Duchess she meant to be. And Amabel came alone and plain into the long rooms full of the people who had watched her lowered for 7 years, and held her back straight, and was cut and stared at and whispered over by 100 people at once, and bore it, and crossed the bright floor to where her husband stood waiting to be rid of her with the deed in her 2 hands. The Duke did it exactly as he had promised himself he would, in front of them all, in the fullness of his contempt. He made a little speech of it, easy and cruel and charming, about how it was best for all parties that an arrangement so long unhappy should be brought to a dignified close, and how her Grace had herself most sensibly agreed to sign the necessary paper, and he took the deed from her unresisting hands and spread it on the card table that had been set ready. And he dipped the pen, and he signed his name to it with a flourish, large and careless and proud, the way a man signs a thing he signs a great deal, without reading past the first line, before the whole assembled county. And then he held the pen out to her, smiling, to sign herself away. She took the pen, but she did not sign. She turned instead to the room, and she spoke, in the clear, steady voice her father had given her, and it carried into a silence that fell like a dropped cloth. "You are all witnesses," she said, "that the Duke of Alderley has this night of his own free will, and before you all set his hand to a deed putting away his wife. I am glad of it. I have wanted it these 7 years. And now, since he did not trouble to read the paper, he was so eager to sign, I will read you the part of it that matters. For it is a part he has never seen, though it has waited for his signature since before our wedding day." And she read it out, clause by clause, in the ringing quiet, the whole cold, beautiful machine of it. The loan that was never a gift, the lands held forfeit to the trust upon the day the Duke should of his own act put his wife away. The debts gathered these 7 years into one patient hand, now all fallen, due at once. She read them the plain sum of it in the end, in words a child could follow, that by the paper he had just signed in his own hand, of his own will, before them all, the Duke of Alderley had that very night ceased to own 1 acre or 1 shilling of everything her father's gold had bought him, that Fenmarch and its lands and its rents were hers now wholly and in law, and that he was left with his 300 years of title and the 300 years of debt beneath it, and nothing else in the world at all. There is a kind of silence worse than any uproar, and it fell now upon the long, bright rooms. The Duke stood over the signed deed, with the smile going to ruin on his handsome face, understanding by degrees, as the slow understand, the size of the thing he had just done to himself with his own proud hand. And at his elbow, Lady Sabine Marrow understood it faster, for she was quick where he was vain, and she saw in one white instant that the man she had spent an autumn winning was not a duke with a fortune at all, but a bankrupt with a coronet, and that there was nothing here for her and never would be again. She did not, however, get the chance to slip away, for the grey man was there. Elias Crane, keeper of the Shire's secrets, who had been at the back of the room as he had said he would be, came forward now to the Duchess's side, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not need to. He said only to the room, but for Lady Sabine, that it was a pity so many present had been imposed upon by a person going by the name of Marrow, and that any who wished to know why a certain house in the north had closed its doors to that person some years since, or by what name she had been christened, or what had become of the elderly gentleman whose fortune she had last had the keeping of, had only to call upon him at his chambers, where the whole of it was matter of record. He said no more than that. He did not need to. In that country a thing did not have to be shouted. It had only to be known that it could be. And Lady Sabine, who had built her whole life on a name that would not bear looking into, saw the doors of that county begin to close upon her one by one exactly as she had meant them to close upon another, and she gathered the wreck of her dignity and went out through the parting crowd alone, and was not seen in that shire again. There was no triumph in it that Amabel could find standing there with the pen still in her hand, and the room full of faces turned at last toward her, in a wonder that had nothing of pity in it. There was only the old sad justice of a thing long buried, come up into the light. She looked once at the ruined man who had been her husband, and felt, to her own surprise, no hatred left at all, only a kind of distant weariness, as one feels toward a storm that has finally blown itself out. Then she folded the signed deed and put it away in her reticule beside her father's letter, and she did not sign her name beneath the Duke's after all, for the paper did not need her name to do its work, and she found she would not spend her own hard-won name upon the same page as his. She would keep it for better paper. She turned and walked back down the long, bright room, and this time the crowd did not cut her, it made way. They set her father's affairs and her own in order that winter, in the quiet, proper way such things are truly done, with lawyers and time and the weight of an unanswerable deed behind them, and at the end of it, the woman whose name had been on nothing at all held in her own hand the deeds of Fenmarch and its lands and its rents, with her name, her own name, Amabel, at the foot of every one. The county that had lowered its voice for her for 7 years learned a new voice to use, and used it, and came to her doors, and she received them or did not as it suited her, having learned exactly what such doors and such voices were worth, which was little. She read her father's letter again on the first quiet night that was wholly her own, and understood at last the whole of what it said, the deepest part that she had kept locked in her own breast since the night Crane gave it her. For the letter did not speak of money at all past the first pay. It spoke, an old dying man to the daughter he loved beyond his own life, of the one thing he had wanted for her and had not been able to give her living, which was not a fortune, and was not even a revenge, but was simply this, that she should never again in her life be a thing that other hands disposed of, a name folded into another name and lost. A paper, signed by someone else. He had not been able to make her husband love her. He had not been able to make the world take a chandler's daughter for the equal she was. But he had found, with the one power he truly owned, a way to put into her own hands the deed of her own life, so that whatever came, she should sign for herself. When the day comes, he had written, and it will come, do not weep, and do not beg, and do not hate. Take back your name, and go and live. That is all I ever wanted. That is the whole of my estate, and I leave it to you entire. And she sent for Tamsin, who came laughing and crying at once, and was set right, and never wanted a place again. She kept Crane as her own man of business, as her father had kept him, and the gray man served her to the end of his days in the same exact silence, at the back of every room she was ever in, and asked for no thanks, and would have been embarrassed past bearing to be given any, and she never gave him any in words, and he understood that perfectly. And it was the fullest thanks between them that either could have borne. She did not stay to be a wonder in a county she had never loved. She let Fenmarch to a good tenant who would keep it kindly, and she went that spring to the capital where her father's name still meant something honest, and she took up the running of what he had built, which no one had ever thought to leave in a woman's hands, and she ran it better than the men who had pitied her. And in time the name of Voss rose again in the counting houses and the coffee rooms where once men had stood to hear it, and stood again. There is a habit she kept to the end of her long life that no one who did not know the story could ever understand. She never framed the deed of Fenmarch, nor the ruinous paper the Duke had signed, though both were hers to hang in gold if she had wished. She kept those locked away, for they were only the tools of the thing, and not the thing itself. What she framed and hung where she would see it every morning of her life was her father's letter, the yellowed folded sheet in the hand she had known before she could read, with its plain last line, "Take back your name and go and live." And beside it, smaller, she hung one thing more, the very first paper of that whole strange autumn, the little note in Crane's spare upright hand that had come back to her from London faster than any answer had a right to, the one that had said, before she understood any of it, "Read nothing they put before you until I am come." For she had understood, by the end, the whole shape of what had happened to her, and it was this. In a country ruled by names written down on paper, she had been born a woman, which was to say, born with her name, promised to be folded into another's, and signed away before ever she could hold a pen. A great house had taken her in, and used her, and meant at the last to sign her out of her own life with a stroke before the whole county, and had been perfectly within its rights to, by the only law that country kept. And one old man, who could give her no throne and no love that the world would let her keep, had given her instead the one thing that outlasts all of it, which was her own name on her own paper, to sign or to withhold as she chose, for the rest of her days. Every respectable thing in that world had agreed, that a woman's name belonged on nothing. And one autumn, a woman had quietly asked a smiling man to sign one last paper, and had taken back, with that single stroke of his careless pen, her name, her house, her father's honor, and the whole of her own life entire. It was the making of her, in the end, and it had begun with a paper she was told to read and a paper she was told not to sign.